It was December. The U.S. 12th Infantry Regiment were in high spirits. They had already won several battles all across France. They all expected to be home by Christmas, all except a man called Robert Howard. He had a bad feeling about the coming few months. Robert and his companions were seated around a table playing cards. He wasn't exactly winning, but he didn't really care. "How long do you think it'll be until we win the war and go home?" he asked one of his friends. "Oh, maybe a few weeks," he replied. "Maybe a month at most." Robert had a feeling that he was dead wrong. "You know what I think?" Robert asked him. "No, what?" "I think it'll be a little longer than that." It was foggy that morning, so most of the regiment had to stay close together so that they wouldn't get lost in the mist. "Cheery morning, huh?" Robert said, his sarcasm obvious. His friend replied, "Can't imagine why." After breakfast, they had their daily jobs, such as shoveling snow, getting water from the almost frozen spring, and, even though extremely difficult in these conditions, scouting the perimeter for signs of enemy activity. Robert was assigned the latter. He grumbled as he put on his winter gear and trudged into the snow. By then, most of the fog had cleared, and it was safe to scout the perimeter without getting lost. As he made his way across the frozen wasteland, he found barbed wire, buildings that were obliterated by enemy fire, debris, scattered guns, and even bodies of dead soldiers. But he didn't see any sign of enemies. When he finally arrived back to camp, he informed the commander of the regiment that he had seen no enemy activity. After he was dismissed, he headed back to the tent where he and his companions stayed in. "How was your little trip, Rob?" one of his friends asked with a hint of sarcasm. "Oh, it was pretty refreshing. How was your shuffling, James?" he asked with an equal amount of sarcasm. James's face turned slightly pink. "I may have gotten a splinter or two." His voice trailed off. Robert grinned. He knew James was not one to go around explaining everything in detail. "It's okay, James," he said. "We all get splinters once in a while. Now, who's up for a game of cards?" It was the next morning, and everyone was still asleep, all except James. "Hey, Rob, what time is it?" he asked. Robert checked his watch. 5:27 a.m., he said. "And the day? December 16th, 1944. Now, would you cut it out? I only have half an hour of sleep left, and I don't want you to ruin it." "Fine," he said. But before he could go back to sleep, enormous explosions sounded outside. Robert woke up with a start. The two of them ran outside to see what was going on. "Artillery!" another American shouted. "Get in cover!" But right after he finished his sentence, a blast threw him into a tree. James and Robert took cover behind a pile of shoveled snow. Soon, other Americans took cover too. Explosions were everywhere. "Do you think this artillery barrage is a German counterattack for one of our earlier battles?" James asked. Shouting to be heard, a deafening sound of artillery shells hitting the ground. "I don't know," Robert shouted back. It was another hour until the explosion stopped. American soldiers were making their way through the rubble, searching for any injured soldiers. James and Robert ran to help them. "You'll be all right," James reassured a soldier with a bleeding leg. "Just hold on, Private." Robert looked up to see dim figures emerging from the snow. "Germans!" he yelled as others looked up. Sure enough, dark gray figures were making their way across the frozen wasteland. "Get in your positions, men!" the commander shouted. James and Robert, all the other Americans, ran to hide behind piles of snow and other debris. They all drew their weapons. As the German soldiers neared the camp, James, Robert, and all the other Americans rose from cover and opened fire on the Germans. Several were cut down. They fired back and ran for cover. Bullets flew in every direction, a few finding their marks. "There must be thousands of them," Robert said. "We won't last long against this many Germans. We need to retreat." "Sounds good to me," James replied. "I'll go find the commander." As James disappeared into the smoke, one of the Germans threw a grenade. It landed right by Robert. He quickly threw it back. The explosion shook the ground as Robert ducked behind the pile of snow he used as cover. Soon he heard the order to fall back. As they retreated, the Germans rose from cover and fired a volley of machine gun fire. Americans were falling everywhere. Robert finally spotted James, trying to duck while he ran to avoid the relentless firing of German machine guns. "Hey!" Robert shouted, trying to get James's attention. James turned his head and saw Robert. He ran over to him. "We can't keep going like this. We'll be murdered," Robert said. "We have to find cover, fast!" They both looked around, but all they could see were trees, which wouldn't give them nearly enough cover. They had to find something bigger. Soon they found a small town. "Take cover behind the buildings," Robert shouted. All the surviving Americans died behind the dilapidated houses and shops and fired back at the Germans. Robert and James also ran toward the buildings, but the Germans took control of the closest and fired their guns at them. They died behind a thick tree, hoping that it would keep them safe from enemy fire until they found better cover. "We cannot stay here," Robert said, barely audible over the deafening sound of German guns. "We need backup. Do you still have that radio?" "Yes," said James. "I'll call for reinforcements." James took out his radio and called the commander. "We need cover fire. We're pinned down here." "Copy that," said the commander. "We're on it." After James put back his radio, he said to Robert, "The rest of the regiment will give us cover fire while we escape." "Sounds like a plan to me," said Robert. Once they heard several guns sounding, they both ran as fast as they could towards the buildings where their regiment were hiding. Once they made it safely behind the welcoming structure, James and Robert both took out their weapons and fired at the advancing enemy. Then they heard a rumbling sound. That sound chilled the Americans more than the cold itself. "Tanks!" shouted James. "Get down!" But it was too late. The tank fired its enormous main cannon. The blast obliterated one of the buildings right next to them, shattering the cement walls and sending chunks of debris in every direction. Robert and James both ducked behind the wall to avoid being impaled by the sharp pieces of cement. Americans were left injured or killed as the survivors recovered from the blast. Robert and James both peered over the now damaged wall, their ears ringing to see the tank starting to ramble towards them. They quickly ducked. "We need a plan if we're getting out of this alive," said Robert. James scanned the area for anything useful. He spotted a box of what looked like grenades. He quickly brought it over. They wrenched it open. Sure enough, there were half a dozen grenades. "Okay," Robert said, thinking of a plan. If we can manage to throw these grenades at the tank, it should be enough to destroy it." They picked up the grenades and hurled them over the wall. A few seconds later, several explosions sounded. They both looked up to see that the grenades had found their marks. The tank was destroyed. After they helped care for the wounded, they still had to worry about the advancing German troops. Day after day, they fought without stopping. Day after day, they lost more ground to the enemy. Most days it was too dangerous to go further than 10 feet from the rest of the regiment. It was almost Christmas, and the Germans showed no sign of stopping. The regiment was running dangerously low on supplies. Even though they were in such low morale, James tried to lift their spirits by building a rather large snowman. When he finished, he added an American helmet on top. Then he ducked below the pile of snow, chuckling to himself. Robert came over. "What's going on?" he asked. James pointed at the snowman, its head just poking over the defensive trench. By then, the Germans had noticed the American helmet resting just above the protective wall of snow. Now, both Robert and James were giggling while the Germans opened fire on their frozen enemy. While the snowman was being hailed by German bullets, James and Robert played a game of cards. They also sang Christmas carols with fellow soldiers. "I haven't had this much fun in months," James remarked after they had sang the last chorus of Jingle Bells. Robert passed around some chocolate to the small group. After they had all had some of the delicious treat, they took down the snowman It had had enough holes for one day. It was December 25th, Christmas Day, and the Germans still showed no sign of stopping. James and Robert both fired several shots at the enemy and ducked behind their wall of snow. "Another day in paradise," Robert said. "I wish those Germans could stop fighting just for today, like World War I in the trenches." Both James and Robert had heard about the Christmas truce of 1914. They both wished the same thing would happen there and then. The air itself was as cold as ice. The freezing weather bit through their winter uniforms. Their supplies were all but gone. All that was left was one can of beans and a piece of stale bread. Despite the frozen weather, Robert managed to start a fire. They cooked the beans over the fire. Then they took out the piece of stale bread and dipped it in the beans. It wasn't much of a meal, but it was all they had. If they had had more, they would have had a feast, as James put it. The fighting continued through most of the day. Then, in the early afternoon, they spotted something that was not German soldiers. These were wearing lighter uniforms. As they came closer, James spotted dark green helmets. These were American soldiers. As they neared the trench, they drew their weapons. "Need some help?" their commander asked. "Yes, please," said James, as politely as he could manage. Later, they found out that this was the U.S. First Army that had relieved them. They also gave them fresh supplies, such as blankets, food, ammunition, weapons, winter gear, and even tanks. "We'll certainly give the Germans a surprise this time," Robert said. It was not until the next day when they finally drove the Germans back. To both James and Robert, it was the best Christmas present they had had, and will have for years to come. For them at least, the Battle of the Bulge was over.